My name is Alan Friel, and I'm a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California, working on criminal justice policy and drug law reform. Prior to joining the ACLU, I was employed by the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, where I witnessed firsthand the failure of our so-called war on drugs. My experiences and research has led me to strongly believe that the use and abuse of substances should not be treated as a criminal justice matter, and that decriminalization of drugs, in some form, would best serve the health, welfare, and safety of our nation. The United States was founded to uphold the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our government was created to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity. Yet no single American policy has so threatened our fundamental rights, defeated justice, destroyed tranquility, or worked against the welfare of our people as has the war on drugs, which has really been a war on ourselves. Over the course of this century, regardless of the political party in power, we have waged a war at home against our own people. In the fervor to ferret out drug use and trafficking, we've created what law professors now refer to as the drug exception to the Fourth Amendment, the carving away of the prohibition of unreasonable searches and seizures whenever drugs are involved in the facts of a case. Otherwise law-abiding citizens found with even a trace of drugs, whether or not they were the actual users, now face imprisonment before trial and confiscation of private property in an upside-down Alice in Wonderland forfeiture procedure where the owner must prove the innocence of her property while the government remains silent. They're stripped of their assets that they would use to mount a legal defense, and if convicted of a drug offense, are sentenced to draconian mandatory minimum sentences unrelated to the individual facts of the case. The war on drugs, which was declared by President Nixon in 1973, has been encouraging illegal police practices which had been, by '73, substantially reduced as a result of professionalizing the science of policing. According to the American Bar Association, more than 5% of cases are dismissed after filing due to illegal police activities, and another 10% of cases have key evidence suppressed due to improper police conduct. This means that of the approximately 1.2 million drug arrests in an average year, 250,000 are thrown out because of admittedly false or obviously tainted evidence. How do we justify a war on our citizens by the forces of the state? The single legitimate interest of the government in crafting drug prohibition was to protect the health and welfare of the citizenry. The evidence will clearly show that as a result of drug prohibition, a black market attenuant with violence which pushes impure and unsafe substances on ever-growing markets has resulted and causes more harm to more people in society than would a medical model of harm reduction or even the free market supply of controlled substances. Of course, many argue that drive-by shootings, the undermining of our economic system by money laundering, and the deaths of drug dependents due to impure substances or HIV-contaminated needles is simply the price society pays to take the moral high road of prohibiting substance abuse. However, the government has no mandate and no legitimate authority to protect us from our victimless desires, no matter how self-destructive or risk-attenuate well-meaning people may believe them to be. Otherwise, everything perceived to be dangerous to the individual would be outlawed, including red meat, mountain climbing, and high school sports, each of which killed more people in the last year than did smoking of marijuana. Even if one does not believe in the sanctity of the rights of an individual, drug prohibition is simply poor public policy. Ending the prohibition of drugs would eliminate the egregious violations of civil liberties inherent in drug law enforcement, which is inequitably visited upon poor and minority communities. Unlike the enforcement of most other laws, the drug war is largely responsible for warrantless strip searches at airports and borders, stop and search policies aimed at urban African American and Latino youth, public and corporate forced urine and blood testing without any reason to suspect impairment on the part of the employee, confiscation of private property regardless of the guilt or innocence of the property owner, uncontrolled surveillance, compilation of computer and paper dossiers on hundreds of thousands of citizens, and police reliance on paid informants, imaginary and anonymous tipsters. Not only would a non-belligerent drug policy help promote police reform, but, according to public health experts and criminologists, it would bring an immediate reduction in poisonings and accidental overdoses, infections from shared needles such as AIDS and hepatitis, the number of firearms on the street and the number of drug trafficking-related killings, the number of dangerous booby traps on parklands and in the dens of drug dealers, and the degradation of the business ethics as black marketeers funnel their ill-gotten gains into legitimate enterprises. Official corruption, crowded prison conditions. In fact, 1 in 3 prisoners is serving time for a drug offense. The risk of military intervention in foreign lands such as Panama, and the destabilization of fledgling democracies in developing nations. Since 1914, when we first started to criminalize the use of drugs, in response primarily to racist fears of opium-smoking Asians in the West and so-called coke-crazed Negroes in the South, and to industrial pressure to suppress hemp production, each succeeding administration until the Clinton administration has increased the budget and person power allocated to enforcing drug prohibition, with the effort at least doubling in every administration from Nixon through Bush. In 1933, we ended the war on alcohol, which had started 3 years after the first law criminalizing drugs. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol and, as with narcotics, stripped all regulatory safety protections from its production, distribution, and use, was passed by Congress in 1917. Soon, black marketeers took over peddling unsafe bathtub gin and operating unlicensed, uninspected clubs. As with prohibited substances today, the legal and violence-prone manufacturing, smuggling, and distribution system for alcohol existed only by corrupting officials at all levels of government. Indeed, victims of Al Capone's first machine gun attack were a competing bootlegger, a prosecutor, and an alderman, all dining together at a sidewalk cafe. Since the repeal of alcohol prohibition in 1933, there has not been a recorded incident of a gun battle over legal distribution rights of alcohol. Despite the model of alcohol prohibition, we continue to promote a policy of drug prohibition. This despite suffering systemic violence attenuate to any prohibitionist policy. Now, it's easy to see that the war on drugs is simply a failure and a fraud. Despite drug law enforcement expenditures of more than $15 billion in fiscal year 1990 alone, the unregulated, untaxed, and virtually unpunished commerce in prohibited substances is a U.S. industry as big as oil, autos, or steel. Americans spend $110 billion a year on illicit drugs. The estimated $750 million spent annually for crack in the District of Columbia alone would rank number 390 in the Fortune 500 list of U.S. industrial corporations. Domestically produced recreational drugs have become our nation's second largest cash crop. Marijuana is the biggest cash crop in many states, including California. In New England, marijuana harvests produce more farm income than do Maine potatoes or New Hampshire maple syrup, according to government estimates. The economics of imported drugs are even more startling. A gram of cocaine is worth $2 at the pharmacy, but its value increases 6,000% when it hits the street. By tripling law enforcement expenditures, the government was able to double seizures of cocaine from 100,000 pounds in 1986 to 198,000 pounds in 1988. This merely served to drive up the price of cocaine and lead users to more dangerous, less expensive drugs, namely crack. Our policy, besides being fatally flawed by the laws of supply and demand and the reality of the black market, fails to address the needs of drug dependents. In fact, the first targets of the Treasury Department under the Harrison Act in the early 1920s were treatment professionals, and 25,000 of them were arrested by 1926. Today, we incarcerate addicts and low-level dealers at an approximate cost of $30,000 per year per inmate, filling 1/3 of our prison spaces, but we fail to fund treatment on demand. Even the new Clinton drug policy, which purports to emphasize treatment, fails to significantly increase funding of treatment programs. The primary result on the war on drugs has been the creation of a generation of American outlaws who, to some degree or another, violate the drug laws and thus diminish the value and respect accorded our system of laws. Worse, corruption of political and law enforcement officials across the country has reached a level unforeseen since alcohol prohibition. Who are these outlaws? Who are being arrested and convicted for dealing, smuggling, and using? They include officers of all ranks, of all levels of law enforcement, including the Drug Enforcement Administration and one of my own co-workers in the DEA's Atlanta office, athletes and coaches, award-winning actors and writers, mayors of major cities, lawyers, bankers, doctors, politicians, a generation of urban youth, and even a president of the Indianapolis, Indiana League of Women Voters who testified against her own sons rather than face a life sentence in prison. Those captured by the criminal justice system due to their use of drugs or the lure of drug profits are sent to overcrowded prisons where they are stigmatized and induced into a life of crime. Tragically, the harsh minimum mandatory sentences given to even minor nonviolent drug offenders has led to the early release of violent criminals. Finally, prison violence and disease may turn even a light sentence for a relatively innocent victim of the harsh drug laws into a death sentence. Although it is clearly a mistake to continue to treat the complex social problem of substance abuse as merely a criminal justice issue, rather than seeing it as a public health problem, any drug policy must address several concerns surrounding the abuse of substances. These include alcohol and tobacco. Concerns include non-medical use and abuse of substances, especially by minors, public safety threats by people who are intoxicated, violence and corruption associated with black market distribution, crime associated with feeding the habits of the addicted who must pay inflated street prices to obtain drugs, and consumer protection through standards for purity and labeling. As has been shown, the current policy actually creates or encourages more of these problems than it solves. Even though the Clinton administration has paid lip service to providing increased treatment, we still operate a primarily punitive system of prohibition that does nothing to solve the root problems. A growing number of academics, police chiefs, economists, public health professionals, and clergy are urging the nation to consider examining the probable positive benefits of some form of decriminalization. These benefits might include honest, non-inflammatory public education about the dangers of substance abuse, shifting the resources from interdiction and enforcement, and/or possibly creating a use tax to fund treatment on demand, significant reduction in violent crime, significant reductions in property crime, a reduction in the actual use and abuse, decrease in official and corporate corruption, and the restoration of the fabric of civil liberties which gives our system its strength and breeds respect for the law. In closing, I'll address several of the commonly held myths that confront the reform of drug policy. Some argue that drugs or drug use create crime. However, no drug has been proven to be criminogenic in that it causes the user to commit crimes. However, studies have shown a nexus between violent behavior and either alcohol or amphetamine abuse. And certain conduct, such as operating an automobile, has been proven to be inherently dangerous while intoxicated. 80% of drug-related crimes are related to distribution of a black market commodity. The remaining 20%, which represent primarily property crimes, would arguably decrease if drugs were free or less expensive. Now, another mistaken belief is that drug use destroys productivity in the workplace and at school. But it is substance abuse, not use, that affects productivity. Employers and educators have every right to demand productivity, but we must not confuse use with abuse, or cause and effect. Abuse can and should be treated. Furthermore, alcohol and drug dependency are often signs of clinical disorders rather than the cause. We'd be better to treat the real problems. It has also been argued that decriminalization would increase the level of abuse and make our problems worse. However, there's no evidence to indicate that a rational form of decriminalization will lead to increases in either use or abuse. Rather, just the opposite appears to be true. Alcohol prohibition and its repeal are a model for comparison, although historians disagree over the meaning of the statistics that are available. We can turn to Alaska. When marijuana was legal, its per-person consumption rate was 1/3 less than that of any of the lower 48 states. When marijuana was recently recriminalized in Alaska, the use of dangerous inhalants such as glue skyrocketed to make Alaska the lead nation in teenage inhalant abuse. The best example, however, may be the European nations which are experimenting with the decriminalization or with a harm reduction model, all of which report actual decreases in usage rates. Lastly, it is said that the United States is bound by international treaties to criminalize drugs currently designated as controlled substances. While this is true, the Congress can void a treaty merely by passing a more current law. Furthermore, the United States was the primary force behind these treaties, and many of the nations would prefer not to be bound by the treaty, but remain so under the United States' threat of stoppage of aid or relations. In conclusion, we cannot win the war on drugs, nor can we afford to lose it. Therefore, it is necessary to devise new policies, neither war nor surrender, which come to terms with the reality of human substance use and abuse. Our free society must reject becoming a police state in order to control behavior, which is found unacceptable to a vocal minority. It is time for a national debate on radically altering the way this nation deals with substance abuse and use. Now, I have no answer to the question of what drug policy would look like after prohibition. I believe that all forms of a non-belligerent drug policy should be debated and discussed as a primary and urgent matter on the American agenda. We might try pilot programs in selected areas. Some models may be more appropriate than others for some substances. However, it is clear that our current policy has failed to serve either users or society and benefits only the criminal element. When a system fails, we must try to create a better system. I'd like to thank the Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts for providing much of the content of this presentation. The ACLU of Southern California holds a drug policy committee meeting once a month. For more information, call 213-977-9500 for meeting times. Thank you.